Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for a Kratos webinar. This afternoon, you have two titans of the planning sector eagerly awaiting to debate, argue, and even praise the planning white paper that has been out for consultation. We're assuming that all of you, like my good self, have read it, and we will be dispensing with the explanations and the background and the process that's gone behind. But let me tell you a little bit about Kratos if you've not met us before. We're a specialist local government consultancy providing planning communications, advisory support for local authorities, supporting the creation of new sustainable communities, providing effective public affairs and public relations campaigns. And our team works nationwide, supported by offices in Southampton, Bristol, Manchester, and of course, London. We have some questions already, and they've been incorporated in some of the questions that we're going to be asking. Others will be used and be credited as we go along. There is a question and answer function at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to put questions in there. With the time we've got, forgive us in advance if we don't make your question, but we will pass them on to Christopher, and he can add them to the millions that he's now receiving in his post bag. So let me now introduce the guests. Do they need introducing? Christopher Kakowski, QC, is known as Kit Kat. He is a legend in the planning world and is one of the 5 people who have been members of the government's task force who have developed with civil servants the proposals in the white paper. I've worked with Chris just once. His first action was to inform me that having successfully won a resolution to grant against officers' recommendations with a majority of 1, that the borough solicitor had made a terrible mistake and I had to go back a month later and achieve the same outcome all over again. That said, we were JR'd on a totally different reason, and we got the pleasure of watching a master in action in the High Court and the Court of Appeal. The other guest is no lesser a legend, but for the first time in decades, he can actually say what he feels about a government policy. So, we share him with HGH and Town Legal, and we're delighted that Steve works with us at Kratos. This is an opportunity for 2 authorities on planning to share their thoughts and talk through the government's white paper. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask Steve to start gently building up with questions for Chris.
Thanks very much, Nick, and good evening, Kit Kat. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. If that's your most difficult question, I'm very pleased.
Well, you start gently. And of course, in terms of legends, I think I'm just a legend in my lunchtime. I do want to ask you a question, but before I do ask you the first question, just a bit of to understand what I'm going to try and do. I want to try and hold a mirror up to some of the stuff that's been talked about. I mean, we've talked about the white paper having big ideas and a lot of call for details about how this might work. But that is what I used to do when I was chief planner. I was often get a big idea, and one of the things I used to say is, how does this work? Trying to bring a pragmatic approach to it. So forgive me. I'm going to try and unpack some of the things that have been talked about and try and explore how does it work? And I'm going to begin with some of this stuff about public engagement. Okay. I've seen on a webinar, and I think you confessed to being very angry when the white paper was launched. Indeed, I think you said you shouted at the radio. Being very angry when people were saying this was going to be undemocratic, and you've said, and I've heard you say it, no, on the contrary, it's going to be even more democratic, and more people are going to be involved. So, sort of, my question to start off with is sort of, how do you think that's actually going to work? Who's going to get involved? When are they going to get involved? And what are they going to get involved about?
Okay. Well, I was particularly, my sort of shouting at the radio moment was when the one of the key things in the white paper, as you know, is a significant sort of revamp of the local plan making system. And the way it was being portrayed on that particular programme, and indeed on several other sort of media programmes since then, has been that in relation to making local plans and planning applications, the public would have much less say, the community engagement would be much less. In effect, things would be done to people rather than people being involved in working out what's to happen in their area and what's not to happen in their area. And this, did wind me up, I have to say, because the very first thing that we discussed as a task force in relation to, ideas for change in the planning system was how to change and reform and hopefully make better local plan making. And right from the get-go, right from our very, very first meeting when we talked about this as a task force, right, literally within the first few minutes of our discussions opening, straight in there, we were very, very clear indeed as a task force that we very much wanted this system to bring people more into the evolution of local plans. How's this going to work? Well, I mean, certainly there are a lot of hopes being pinned on the digitalization of the planning system, of plan making, so that it's going to be easier to access the planning system. The idea obviously being able to look on your smartphone and being able to see what's emerging in your area and being able to engage in a debate about it. But I mean, basically, we very much want to take all examples of best practice across the nation at the moment and build on those. I mean, in effect, what we're trying to do is to find a way in which people who perhaps don't normally get themselves involved in planning and planning decisions that are coming in their area do find a way in which they can be involved. So what they're going to be involved in doing, well, on the local plan side, and remember the idea is that in certain instances, local plans will actually grant outline planning permission. So you've got a 2-in-1 process, so not only making an allocation in today's language, but also granting an outline consent. I mean, certainly right from the very earliest stage of the evolution of local plans, we're extremely keen on the idea of the public being involved as widely as possible and communities being involved as widely as possible in the shaping of those plans. Including obviously the local councils and councillors. And as in those local plans, there would be outline permissions granted as well, then there would be public engagement, not just on, what shall our local plan look like, but on whether or not certain planning permissions should or shouldn't be granted. In the normal planning system, if you like, in the rest of the planning system outside plan making, and there are no proposals at all in the white paper to reduce public involvement. I mean, quite the opposite. We're trying to make the material that goes with planning applications much more easily accessible to the public, much easier to understand. So big ideas like reducing the amount of stuff that goes in with planning applications to make it more readily digestible and understandable to people who want to comment on those applications. A streamlining and simplification of environmental assessment, strategic environmental assessment, and sustainability appraisal work for local plans to make these documents much easier to understand and use. All of these things are actually designed for one common purpose, which is to actually enable people to be engaged in a much more effective way with the planning system. Now, if the question to me is, well, how's this actually going to work in all the practical details? I mean, that detail isn't there yet. And this is, I'll say this probably in response to quite a few of the questions, because we were just trying to reset the planning system, if you like. But yes, there's a lot of detailed work to be done. But from my perspective and my take on all of this is that yes, there are lots of details which are needed, but the details needn't be complicated. The details can actually be quite simple to make the system work.
I think I get that Kit Kat, but I also think that I'm conscious that when I looked at the makeup of the task force, I mean, there was no one on the actual task force that had actually ever written a plan. And I'm sure you took advice from people who had. But I have been involved. I have supervised the making of plans, and I do know that some of the things are both time-consuming and resource hungry. And I don't think anybody would take any issue with what you have set out there in your answer as being the ambition that we want to achieve. But I think that the thing that concerns me is trying to drill down into both the way in which people can really influence the outcome when you've got a plan which ultimately will be one that has every piece of land in one of 3 different types of land use. It will be dealing with figures that are being given by the government, and it will be rules that are being set all within the 18 months that you have to do before you submit the plan for examination. And I know from my own experience from working in North Yorkshire, where we had 5 different market towns, even if I ran a digital consultation basis, you're not going to get away without having some boots on the ground. And if you do run a consultation exercise, then it could take 5-6 weeks to complete the exercise, and then you've got to consider the outcome. Leeds, I think, had 23,000 responses to its plan. Quite frankly, some of the practical stuff, banking what you said about the ambition, the practical stuff, I think I feel a little bit, you can't just say it'll be all right in the night. You've got to think about how these things are going to actually happen on the ground.
Sure.
Was any thought given to any of this?
Yeah, a lot of thought was given to all of this. I mean, we see that, a big piece in all of this is, how much material, how much stuff, how much evidence, needs to be there in order to make a plan. So if we think about two things, at the moment, the advice is very, very clear that the evidence base for a local plan needs to be proportionate, quote unquote. I've never seen a proportionate evidence base for a local plan. There's just so much material about so many things spread across so many issues. This stuff is done because the process takes so long. It has to be redone because it's out of date after a year or two, and on we go. So the significant streamlining of the amount of material that needs to be there to support a local plan, the making of a local plan, coupled with, don't forget, a big idea in the white paper is that local plans should actually focus really exclusively on these three areas. Where are things going to be built, where are things encouraged to be built, and where are things discouraged from being built, what's protected. So a very map-based local plan, as you know from the white paper. But in other words, shorn, without all these hundreds of pages of development management policies, all the minutiae that goes with so many of these local plans, all of that would be taken out in the system that's spoken about in the white paper. So thus saving a lot of time, effort, and money, to be quite frank. But yes, I take your point that in a local plan, which is going to count, because we're trying to make these things more meaningful. So for the local community to know, well, this is what's likely to be built here, this is what's protected from being built upon, etc., etc. Yeah, there'll be a lot of people who will want to get in, well, we hope there'll be a lot of people who want to get themselves involved in all this. Certainly when I, because this is very close to my heart, I played a big part in writing this part of the ideas in the white paper. Certainly when I sort of set to on all of this, I didn't imagine there would be just one consultation, at the outset. We know 18 months later, whatever it is, we've submitted the plan to the inspectorate for examination. And I envisaged the ability for there to be consultations and reconsultations and checking of particular issues through that whole process of the evolutionary plan.
Well, that's been the slightly. I imagined that's what was envisaged, but in terms of a cycle of consultation, you talk about best in class. There are people that have been very good at this and people less so. And I suppose you could try and say, I don't know, you might put this in statute and say, this is the way you're going to run a consultation process. Do you think you'd go that far?
Well, first of all, I think the statutory provisions, when they come, are not just going to be sort of the highest level and leave everything to delegated legislation. I think there will be key principles set out in the primary legislation, and then obviously the second legislation sitting underneath that. I personally would see, in relation to how to do a consultation, I myself imagine that would be the subject of policy stroke guidance from national government, from central government, rather than the statute saying, well, here's the minutiae as to how you should go about doing the consultation. But the basic.
I'm going to move on from it in a minute, but I'm sorry. I just need to drill on this issue because see, sure. when I used to consult, there used to be sort of stages like and going way back. You say, well, issues and options. You'd ask people what they thought about the choices were, and then you'd get that response, and then you produce a plan that would say, well, having listened to what you said, here's what we think the answer is, and what do you think of the answer, and then you consult on that, and then you take it forward to an examination, put simply. What I'm not clear about is on the day the gun goes off and you start this process, notwithstanding the fact that I think there could be 3 months in preparation before you get to that stage, getting members to agree the budget and the resources. But when the gun goes off, then what are you consulting people on? Because at that stage, you don't know what the answers are, do you? You can go about saying, is this piece of land growth, or is it renewal, or is it protection? But you don't necessarily have the design codes. They won't necessarily know what they want in that area. If it's a growth area, they won't necessarily know what the quantum is or what the capacity is. I'm just trying to unpack what it is you're consulting on.
Sure. Well, I certainly do. I certainly do not envisage that when the starting gun's fired, that the first thing that happens is here are issues and options, if you like, and here are sort of preliminary thoughts. I don't envisage that being the first. I imagine that I envisage the first stage being, much more open than that. And, it's written in the white paper as a sort of, in effect, a call for sites, a call for areas to be put into growth areas, sub areas within growth areas, renewal areas, and protected areas. So it's much more of a seeking people's ideas and thoughts, people on the positive side, if you like, in terms of development, putting forward sites to be either earmarked for growth or renewal. You can then find, obviously, also on the positive side, but in terms of areas to be protected, people putting forward areas that they consider should be protected for the following, for whatever reasons they wish that to happen. Some of this will arise pretty straightforwardly because I suspect at least national policy, question mark, will there be anything either primary or secondary legislation, but certainly national policy at the very least will set out the categories of land and assets and entities that should be protected in local plans. And so, it isn't going to be overly difficult for local planning authority to work out, well, this is our green belt, these are our conservation areas, this is our AONB, etc., etc. So the real heavy lifting, if you like, would be in, well, which sites and areas are going to be annotated for growth and therefore for planning permissions, which are going to be annotated for renewal. In other words, with a list of uses where the plan will encourage those things to come forward but won't actually grant consent. So that's, I think, where most of the work is going to be, and where most of the sort of, the real debates and scraps, if you like, are going to happen.
So do you think that stage will be in defining the three different types of land use? Is that a sort of a plot by plot allocation, or is it broader than that? I mean, one of the things I disagreed with in the Jack Airy paper was when he said every piece of land has got a current designation under the current system. I don't think that's the case. I think that within settlement limits, there's quite a lot of land that has no use defined to it, except for the fact it's in the settlement limits, and similarly in the countryside. But this will do that. This will mean that every piece of land will have one of three allocations, and quite apart from what might be a nightmare of contacting every landowner to say what you think the land use is going to be and whether they agree with it. Is it a patchwork of plot by plot, or do you envisage it as being broader than that?
Okay. No, it's a question that I've often been asked, and, as with all the questions, it's a very, very good question indeed. So I imagine for the growth and for the renewal areas, and particularly if we think about the growth areas where consents will be granted, I really do imagine that these will comprise, they've been described as sub-areas in conversations about the white paper with the department, a whole host of sub-areas, a whole number of sub-areas will together go to make up a growth area or indeed a renewal area. So these would draw down to, if you think in the growth areas where consents would be granted, these would go right down to the finer grain, obviously, of individual sites which are granted consent by the plan for use A plus use B, with these density limits, these height limits, whatever they might be. So I think particularly for the growth areas where we will have consents granted, a typical growth area would be made up of any number of sub areas and sites, which each individually will have their own outline consent, rather than some great blanket across, a quarter of a local authority's area as a growth area, and consent is granted in a great blanket way for, for residential or for business development or whatever it might be. So yes, I do. When you say patchwork quilt, jigsaw puzzle assembly of various different sites and sub areas. Yeah,
that's very helpful, Kit Kat. But I suppose there's an issue. It's helpful because I did wonder what the difference was between the call for sites in the white paper and the current SHLA process, the Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, which calls for sites already. And from your answer, it's that all the sites will be called for effectively, and people will put forward their site in one of the three categories, presumably, and you will then go forward on that. Now, it does come back to my timing question, that if I have got sites which are coming forward for growth, and I'm not only got to take that through a local plan which allocates it for growth, but I've effectively got to grant it outline consent as well, which means picking up the conditions. Again, I come back to my point about how realistic is it that you're going to have that done in 18 months? And that's lots of people are asking me that. Is it a realistic timetable?
Yeah. No, I agree. And obviously the outline consents won't be granted until the end of the process when the plan is adopted. So we've got to build the examination process into this as well. So I think, we mustn't leave out of account that time as well. But in terms of the outline consents and the realism or otherwise of all of this, I think to me, the key to all of this is how complex or simple, straightforward are these outline consents going to be? And it's a question which has very often been put back to me. And certainly I'd envisage these outline consents being pretty outlined, shall we say. I was very keen in the work that we did in the task force not to speak of permissions in principle, PIPs, because to be honest, I don't think the planning system has really got its head around what permissions in principle are, but we all understand what outline consents are. And for those of us who have been doing this for a while, your good self, Steve, me, and some others. You don't have to think back too far ago to recall an era of outline planning consents that were pretty outlined, that weren't, the sort of outline consents we're now very used to, where, in effect, so many details are fixed at outline stage that are not really outline consents, as per the statutory intention. So I think an awful lot of these questions, which I'm quite rightly asked about realism, can it be done? I have so much work that will need to be done. How on earth are you going to be able to do it in anything like that timescale? To me, a lot of the answers to those questions lie in how much detail will you actually be fixing in these outline consents. And certainly the white paper speaks about quite, very few fixes. It actually only refers to density and height. I'm sure there would be other parameters, if you like, that would be set by these outline consents. But I certainly don't see, personally, I don't see these outline consents being sort of, that sort of twilight zone between the outline consents are actually envisaged in the statute and, a full planning permission. At the moment, outline consents sit in between.
I was always quite a fan of PIPs in local plans, to be honest, because it struck me that was a way of getting financing agreed. It wasn't so much a planning issue as much giving certainty to financiers that you would be able to proceed with an allocation of a plan. But arising from your answer, though, two questions. The first is about, well, if I'm not sorting out the outline permissions till later in the process when the plan's adopted, what am I consulting people on earlier on in the process? Because they will want to know what it is actually going to be defined on those sites, because that's what people are concerned about. So again, there's an issue about, people don't like being consulted when I don't know what I'm consulting them on. And there is an issue about the simplicity. How do you, and this is the second question, is how simple can you make an outline application when you've got EIA and SEA requirements to meet?
Okay. So on the first of those, by referring to the examination process, my point wasn't, sorry, if I just take a step back, when the plan is submitted for examination, then yes, it will have, what the local authority, the plan making authority considers, are the growth areas and the particular sites within the growth areas, and it will set out, in effect, what the local authority intends to grant by way of outline consents, because that would be shown by the map, the key, and the text that goes with the key. So, when it's submitted, it would have been through this process of discussion. There's the plan that the council wants to submit, it submits it. All I meant by the time that the examination would take is there would be time beyond the first main period of time when the local authority is evolving its plan. There would be time beyond that through the examination process for these things to be examined and debated and considered, and for people to be able to say, well, I think that's dreadful, it just doesn't work, and they'll be heard through the examination process, and others to say, well, yeah, we think you've got the wrong site, you should have this site instead. So that's all I meant by that. But it's an important point, because this is a longer process than just the authority drawing up its plan. There is the examination process where an independent person will examine whether the plan is sustainable or not. As for how simple can an outline consent be? Well, actually, an outline consent can be very straightforward indeed, and certainly the statute, as far as I'm concerned, envisages a fairly sort of outline, fairly bare outline. It's interesting you made the point about PIPs and financing. Certainly the pushback I've had is that sort of outline consents probably won't be a sound enough basis to raise finance. So, there is, to me, in the pushback I've had and discussions I've had, this is a point that obviously will need to be thought through very carefully. when the white paper proposals are taken forward into legislation. And as for SEA, SA, which are the two local plan making things, I mean, I've been very, very clear in this indeed, and quite passionate about it, but none of the stuff in the white paper about local plans, forgive me, is going to work in the timescales that are laid out unless SA and SEA is significantly reformed, because it's just, you can forget it otherwise. So there's got to be a much more straightforward way of looking at the environmental consequences of the choices that are faced, have to be faced up to in making a local plan, much more straightforward, easier to grapple with and to get on with than the current system that we've got.
Yeah, I think that's partly why I asked the question, KitKat, because I mean, unless you have that sort of reform to EIA and SEA, then some of these things are going to be a bit challenging, to say the least.
They won't happen. I'm absolutely 100%. They won't happen unless.
No. But how do you maintain a robust protection of environmental issues if you don't have a robust EIA and SEA process? I mean, there are risks. You make it so simple to get the plan through, but then you have the impacts that good planning is supposed to take into account in any event.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm quite sort of evangelical about this. Certainly the image I have of a reformed SA, SEA, and EIA system, all these acronyms. But what I have very much in mind is a system which would be a lot better than what we've got at the moment, because you will actually be looking at what counts, which are the environmental consequences of the decisions that we face, rather than getting bogged down in process issues, rather than getting bogged down in lots of technicalities and legal requirements, which just make the thing very, very technical and very, very hard to access for people who want to understand this, who aren't professionals in that particular field. So I see the changes to all the A's, SEA, EIA, SA. I see all the changes actually leading to a robust and clear and easy to access way in which to examine the environmental consequences of decisions that have to be made in making a local plan, for example. So I'm certainly not envisaging a cheap and cheerful version where all this stuff is brushed under the carpet. Quite the opposite. I mean, another one of the things that's been really winding me up about the pushback about the white paper, people are, there's a great campaign going saying, "Oh, stop all these changes because they're going to lead to all sorts of things happening without environmental issues being thought about." And, to me, that's complete nonsense, because that's.
But Christopher, I think that there's some really interesting things about the creating a template of the policies so that local authorities are not making their own policies, so reducing the variation, which I think is all incredibly helpful. The time frame is fascinating, because in that the public engagement has to be substantial. If we're going to reduce down the process of making the final decisions, in what I would know as reserved matters, we must have absolute buy-in from the community. And the community, I love the comment here that developers and local authorities are not very well thought of and not very well trusted. And the ambition of this white paper is to reverse that, which I would say is, as long as the planning system does what the public want it to do, they will be happy. It's when they get 300,000 homes that they don't want that they're unhappy. But how would the structure be created? Do you envisage this being implemented? Because for me, the councillors have to provide leadership. And every time I get involved with a local plan, I find it's the officers providing the leadership to something that there's a variation in every local plan, even down to how the inspectors are working. There is great variation. This system requires much more format and shape, and so that people can trust it, or it won't work at all, surely.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly envisage through the task force, and there's reference in the white paper, that in effect the department will be, through its guidance on plan making, will be giving a lot of guidance as to how to make these plans and what should go into these plans. And remember, in a way, there'd be, in one way of looking at it, there'd be a lot less in these plans, because you're stripping out all the policies, but all the written policies, which take up hundreds of pages in a typical local plan at the moment. But on the other hand, what's left in the new style plans will be far more meaningful, as far as I'm concerned, because they will give a much firmer steer as to what's going to happen where, and growth areas outline consents will actually be granted, and what's to be protected and so on. So, but in terms of the structure of all of this and leadership, yes, one of the big questions is, well, are these plans going to be, at local level, going to be made by local councils in the sense of the council laws, deciding what their local plan should be? I mean, to me, it's very, very important indeed that local plans should remain, at least through the process which is followed at local authority level, should remain the plan of the council. That's to say, the council laws, rather than this process being hijacked, if you like, by professionals. I mean, I personally, obviously there's legislation to come, but my own view very strongly would be that we shouldn't be saying, well, a local plan should be written exclusively by the officers of the council and put forward for examination without members, without councillors being involved in this. I mean, it seems to me that councillors, personally, my own view very strongly held, is that councillors have to be involved. It has to be the council's plan, which means the elected councillor's plan, it seems to me. I mean, that's my view about this.
Yes, can I come back then on the role of central government in that? I mean, I've always found that the relationship you have with members, the trust you have between elected members and the specialist advisors is critical to delivering a good plan. Of course, the members need to own the plan to go forward. But we have a proposal clearly in the new system that the actual quantum of houses will be determined by central government. So government will give you hand down the figures. And I suppose I've got a couple of questions about this. The first is you won't expect. The first is, quite how does the government decide what the figure is going to be? And it's interesting because there's been different noises on this, whether or not they're going to give you a figure and then say that's it, or whether they're going to give you a figure having already taken into account the environmental constraints and the capacity issues, or whether, as is now, they're going to give you a figure to the council, and then it's for the council to come back and say, well, I see your figure, but I can't deliver that many. And if it is that latter one, what's the difference between the new system and the current one?
That's an easy one. I can answer that one. It's not the latter. So if you think about this terrible jargon which is used at the moment, we have a system where the government, through the standard methodology, in effect hands out to local authorities a policy off figure. So this is the figure which, the figure for need, in inverted commas, that we think, in your area, we the government think you should be meeting. And then each local authority, through making its local plan, applies a policy on approach of saying, well, actually, because of our constraints, we can't meet that figure. We have chats under the duty to cooperate to see if we can, get some of our housing to go somewhere else to another authority. A classic example is an authority that's heavily constrained either by the green belt or an AONB or whatever it might be, saying, well, look, our gross number is X, but we can only practically meet half X or 3/4 of X because of these constraints. So the number in the white paper system, the number it's envisaged will be a policy on number, will be central government saying through I'm convinced there'll have to be some process to arrive at this, obviously, not just central government plucking a figure out the air, but through a process, central government will say to each local authority, your policy on number, taking into account your constraints, is X, and that is the number you have to make provision for in your local plan. And this is an important plank in the in the structure in the white paper, because it's aimed at ensuring that at the beginning of, and actually at the moment throughout the whole local plan process, we go round and round in circles about what should the number be, because the numbers arising from the standard methodology aren't the answer. They're just an important step on the way to the answer. So to me, a way in which we can get on and make these plans in a tighter timescale is to know at the outset what on earth we're trying to plan for in terms of how many homes each local authority area is made to make provision for. So this is an important point.
Well, yeah, I thought you'd say that, and he said no, it's because that's how the white paper reads, and the policy on number.
I'm relieved that I've remembered what it
No,
says.
no, it's good. But I can't help but come back to you and say, well, how's that going to happen then? Because how does this work? Question. Because if central government are sitting, wherever they are, and they're looking at a plan in North Yorkshire, how are they possibly going to know what the constraints are there? They can spot the national parks. They know where the AONBs are. They know where the SSSIs are. But one of the things that I used to do when I was making a plan, and I realised that not everybody in this white paper had ever done one, but I used to do things called urban capacity studies, and I used to look at the urban capacity, work out, talking to the communities, talking to the parish councils, the town councils, a real engaged process to try and work out what the capacity was for growth and development. And I suppose I worry that this figure being handed down to councils, it's going to be very difficult for central government to have a real detailed understanding, a local understanding of what the capacity for development is in a particular area. So how are they going to do that?
Yeah, well, personally, as you know, the white paper doesn't explain how it's going to be done. The only clues which are given are that where there's a mayor in an area, at mayoral level, there would be the ability to have a strategic redistribution of housing numbers. So, every authority has its default number, which arises from national government, but at mayoral level, at strategic level, there'd be the ability to mediate, to sort of, in effect, move the numbers around. Where is there more capacity to take some of these numbers? Where is there less capacity to take some of these numbers? But otherwise, basically, the white paper doesn't get into this. My own view is that, which I've expressed, elsewhere, and including to the department, is that there would need to be some form of process, some form of mediated process, which will allow these discussions to be held and heard before government then says, here are your numbers. And what I have in mind is that, at some scale which makes sense. So, for example, at county level, you could definitely have a system where we know what the default number would be that central government considers as the appropriate number, and we certainly know what the total number for all the individual authorities to go to make up that county are, what all those numbers are. Some process which, as in over a number of weeks, and certainly not months, and most certainly not years, some process which over a number of weeks allows all those authorities to discuss together, mediated, for example, by the county council, or if it was a strategic thing, mediated by the mayor, to have a discussion between the authorities to, in effect, see whether they can come up with an agreed redistribution of the distribution and redistribution of their, what would otherwise would be their individual housing numbers. So duty to cooperate, but with a plus, because the plus is that if at the end of this process there isn't agreement as the distribution and redistribution of these numbers, then the default would apply, the default being the numbers which central government has said to each authority, here are your numbers. So
yeah,
there are ways.
It's interesting, because I was going to ask you whether what was going to replace duty to cooperate, and you described a process there. Well, I suppose there's a couple of questions which occur in listening to that answer. The first is this timescale for the process that is going to be undertaken to agree your figures part of your 30 months or not? Is it a period before the plan, or is it after? Because otherwise you're actually going this 36 months now. Because from experience, and again I draw from my own experience, when we had regional assemblies, that's exactly what used to happen during that process. Now I know it used to be all wrapped up into a regional strategy or regional spatial strategy, but in effect, councils from the areas used to get together and there would be a bun fight over the figures. And eventually the white smoke would go out and you'd be told you had to plan for 290 houses. Now, I thought that was not an approach which the government was going back towards. But it seems to me from your answer, it's something of that ilk. Have I misunderstood?
There certainly won't be regional. I don't see for the foreseeable future any chance of regional planning as you and I and others will remember it. I mean, I think that for all sorts of reasons that ain't going to happen. Whether those reasons are good or bad, we could debate forever, but it's just not going to happen. So So there won't be anything that looks like the old regional assemblies and the regional spatial strategies and all the discussions about all sorts of things. But the idea of authorities getting together and having a mediated discussion, I certainly see as a way in which this issue could be dealt with. A very good point as to whether this is before the starting gun on making the local plan. To me, it would have to be, because the whole idea is that even if you had no process at all, the system would have to start with central government saying, here's your number, now go and make a plan. So that needs to come at the outset. Otherwise, personally, my own view would be, it would be wrong as a matter of first principles to say to an authority sort of 6 months in or something, here's your number, because they'd say, well, we've just spent 6 months going around in circles trying to work out what we're doing. So to me, you would have to start the process with central government saying, well, here are your, and remember this is all about housing numbers, here is your housing number. So logically, you would have whatever process is there to settle what these numbers are, preceding the starting point of your plan making 2.5 years, as is speculated.
Does that mean that every plan in the country, and this may be an unforeseen positive, does that mean that every plan in the country will have a start date, i.e. the government does this process around the country, it does this mediation, comes up with a figure, on a given day, hands out the numbers to all the planning authorities up and down the country, and from that day, everyone starts to do a new plan?
With one caveat, which is important, certainly the way the system is envisaged to get this through in the way that the white paper discusses, where it envisages comprehensive plan coverage during the period of this government, so by 2024, by sometime in 2024, one would need to have a lot of these plans moving forward at the same time. And obviously, there are resource implications around all of that, which is another big debate. But the caveat is that the white paper speaks about giving a year's grace, and whatever the transitional period would be in the statute, but a period of grace for those authorities who have got a recently adopted plan, because it does seem to be wrong as a matter of first principles to say to an authority that within the last year or 18 months, for example, has adopted a plan, to sort of say to them, right, okay, well done, now you've got to straight away start work on a new plan. It seems wrong not to give credit to those authorities, and also given that we're very, very keen to ensure that local authorities don't use the white paper as an excuse for downing tools on the plans that they're working on at the moment. There has to be some incentive for those authorities to continue.
So by 2024 then, and I was going to ask you about how realistic it was to get everybody into shape by then, but by 2024, there'll be some people that have got what I'm going to describe as old plans under the old system that are still valid, and some people that will have new plans under the new system, but by 2024, there'll be a plan everywhere.
Yes, that is the ambition. And in answer to the question, which obviously everyone, even I would ask myself, I don't, with all respect, even I'm capable of working out this one, is that realistic? Well, it is realistic, but only if, frankly, the government gets a move on. So, the legislation is going to have to, get underway next year for this to stand a realistic chance of success.
Chris, can I take us back into where the public come in and the councillors again? If we are successful in this 30-month programme of achieving outstanding community engagement, because I think that's what's needed to have a plan that is fully supported, what's the role of the public and the councillor going to be in this new world where planning applications can come forward and they fit the model? Are they going to go straight to the officers and they will make the decisions?
Okay.
And we haven't touched on what does beautiful look like, and it changes. My clothes I think are great. Some people think I've got no taste at all. And I remember
there's a pattern book that would apply to your shirt. Yep.
And I remember missing out on being an investor in a play called Art, which was about a piece of art, and it's amazingly made a lot of money for the people who invested in it. That subjectivity, and someone discovers that they agreed a plan and they hate the building. What is the role? And also, just to throw in, there's an aspiration to get rid of the JR.
Okay, right. There's three very big things. Let me take them one by one. They're all very. I mean, I'm fascinated by all of them, and we could have probably devoted the whole webinar to just one of them. But if I take each in turn, so the role of councillors vis-a-vis planning applications. So for local plans which are granted consents in growth areas, obviously councils, as we've discussed, as far as I'm concerned, the plan would be the council's plan, and councils will therefore be, front and centre of the plan that's put forward, granting these consents. But no part of this revamped local plan making system is in any way designed to stop people making planning applications. And there will always be planning applications. So, you won't need to make one if you've already got your outline consent, obviously. You'll be going then to reserve matters. But for example, in the renewal areas, permission won't be granted by the plan, so you'll have to make a planning application for that. The renewal areas will give a leg up to a planning application which is consistent with what's written in the plan about uses which are appropriate in the renewal areas. So if a renewal area, part of a renewal area is shown as being appropriate for housing or shops or business or whatever it is, you put your planning application in. If your uses comply with what's in the plan, then that should make it very difficult, to be honest, for a local authority to say, well, we don't like this as a matter of principle, because the principle would have been established in the plan. And then in protected areas, national policy will set out all the protections that apply. So take the Greenbelt as the easy example. There would be, I'm sure there will remain a test of, you can't get planning permission for inappropriate development in the Greenbelt unless you can demonstrate very special circumstances. So there would be these tests and parameters set out. Now, who's going to make these decisions? There is reference in the white paper to, an idea that if your planning application is consistent with the plan, so in a renewal, this would have to be in a renewal area, you put forward a planning application, your uses are indeed the uses which the local plan has said are appropriate for that part of the renewal area. There's an idea in the white paper that those decisions could be made at officer level because they are planning applications where the principle fits with the plan. That's put forward in the white paper as an idea. And the converse of that is where a planning application comes forward which isn't consistent with the plan, then it would remain, in inverted commas, it would be there for councillors to make those decisions. So the most controversial decisions would be for councillors to make, so to speak. They're the ones where, if you ever need discretion to come into this, do we think that good enough reasons have been put forward to go against the plan? Well, speaking personally, it seems to me that is par excellence something for councillors to decide. So that's the sort of world that the white paper envisages, if you like. As for second topic, beautiful. What on earth is beautiful? Well, yes, we would all have our very different views about that. And as I've said on other platforms, I mean, when we started discussing the idea of raising design quality through the planning process, as the lawyer in the group, if you like, I mean, I had to think to myself, well, how can we actually convert this into something which works in a legal sense? Because we can all bang on about, wanting to make design quality a lot better. Of course, any right-thinking person would want to do a better job in many cases than some of the stuff that we see coming out the ground at the moment. I mean, there are lots of great schemes being built around the country, but some which you think, well, surely the planning system could have got a better result than that. So that's why in the white paper there's a lot of emphasis on the idea of having design codes, design guidance, pattern books, and my contribution to this was to think, well, can't we convert some of these into permitted development rights? So if a local community, perhaps through a neighbourhood plan, has evolved its local vernacular that it wishes to see development follow, for example, we talk a lot about housing, so for example, for housing, can't those then bring permitted development rights? So if a developer follows the pattern book which has been established, say in a neighbourhood plan, then they have PD rights to do that, so local community driven. But yes, somewhere along the line has to define in the planning system, well, in our area, this is what we regard as beautiful, which basically means this is what we and then finally, judicial review. Well, paper to try to in any way say that judicial review should be restricted, but what we are aiming for is a simpler planning system which would lessen the drive to judicial review, because, from my perspective, as a practitioner, a lot of judicial review arises because things aren't clear. A planning policy is not explained in clear enough terms. The rules aren't clear enough. So if you write the rules clearly enough, if you write the policies clearly enough, there should be less need to go to the courts to say to the courts, well, he's saying it means this and she's saying it means that. Tell us what it means. To me, it isn't overly complicated to actually explain in clear, simple language what on earth you're trying to achieve in a policy. And if you can do that, then you remove the need to go to court. Consultation process going on at the moment, which is looking at judicial review. But I don't think none of this is the end of judicial review or anything like that. I mean, but it would be great if there was less judicial review, in the sense of less need for judicial review. That's the point. Not that JR is bad. There has to be some control, obviously. But why do we keep having to go to court, to go to a high court and say, well, what the hell does this planning policy mean? To me, it's a nonsense. I mean,
it brings back the importance of getting this system open, transparent, and clear at the very beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what it's all about.
Okay, I want to come back to, you mentioned neighbourhood plans there, and I've got just a couple of questions. I know time is pressing, so I'm going to ask them both, and then if we can get an answer before the end of play. And the first is, you mentioned neighbourhood planning, and of course, people can do neighbourhood development orders now, and could define what could get effectively grant consent for this sort of stuff if they want to. But my question about neighbourhood planning is, and I did ask the Secretary of State this, whether or not he thought it was the end of neighbourhood planning. What role do they have? They've got figures that are given to them. They've got areas of land that are being defined for them by the council. And then they're going to try and come up with the rules of engagement, the pattern books, the design codes. And first of all, there's going to be a bit about how do you keep communities engaged in that process. They don't think that all this is being cascaded down to them. And the second is, from a planning authority's point of view, how on earth do you coordinate the timing of trying to deliver a plan at the end of the day in 30 months? Well, you've not only got to do all the stuff you've already talked about, we've also got to talk to all these community groups and neighbourhood planning forums to actually evolve the design codes, all within 30 months. Is that really what you envisage?
Okay.
And I've got another question.
Was that the first and the second question?
That was the first question.
Shall I have a quick crack?
The second question is more fundamental, and perhaps is a closing question, I think, is that a lot of what your white paper talks about could be achieved by amending the existing planning system to perform better. There's a lot of things you talk about you could just do to the existing planning system, and there's a lot of things that would flow from it. Shorter plans, you don't have to write a doorstop, you can do away with DM policies, you can digitize the planning system. Is it a case that it's my way or the highway? You either agree with me or you're wrong, because I've heard you say, if you think the current planning system is working, you've got to be joking. I think but if I said, no, I do think the planning system needs to work better, is the consultation still open to the idea that you could make amendments to the existing system, drawing from the white paper, and still have a better planning system?
Okay, right. So there's quite a lot for me to deal with there, but I'm gonna have a bash at them. So let's start with neighbourhood planning. So yeah, good question, because the white paper obviously is focused very much on local plans as opposed to neighbourhood plans at the one scale, or strategic plans at the other. A London plan, a Greater Manchester plan, whatever it might be. So looking at the neighbourhood plan side of this, when I do envisage that there will still be neighbourhood plans, but my own vision sounds like I'm sort of being terribly poncy, if you like, but my own sort of idea about neighbourhood plans and what I see for neighbourhood plans, what I see their role as being, is not so much what should go where and what should be protected, because that really should be done through the local plan itself. But I do see neighbourhood plans having a very clear role in relation to what on earth do we want these things which are to be developed in our area to look like. What standards do we see applying? What this beautiful part of it, the design and so on and so forth that we were discussing just a few moments ago. So I do see neighbourhood plans having a role, but a role which is different from, well, it's more focused than the role they have at the moment. So I do see them continuing, but not as sort of replicants of, not as replicas of what we have got used to, is how I would answer that. In terms of timing, how on earth is this all going to be done? You consult with all these people who wish to make neighbourhood plans. I take my hat off, by the way, to people who get involved in making neighbourhood plans. It seems to me to be a thankless task in the current system. So, all credit to people who work on neighbourhood plans, genuinely. So, as for timing, the white paper certainly talks about what I would regard as a sort of paradigm. If it's at all realistic to do this in an area, to do all these things so that by the end of the time you've got your local plan and you've got your pattern books and your design codes and so on and so forth. But the white paper does also speak about an alternative world where these things can't be done all at the same time and where they have to be staged. And so to me, I have to say that at the moment, I would say the more realistic view of the world, if you like, in the future is a world in which the local plans themselves have come forward in their statutory timescale. And, some local authorities may very well have achieved a situation where alongside their local plans and referenced in their local plans, they have all sorts of design codes, master plans, etc. But many local authorities won't have achieved that, and they will come after the local plan. There will then be your design codes and pattern books and so on. So I think in terms of all the things which seem to be this ambitious, realistic, what's ambitious but not realistic, I think that to think that across the entire country we're going to be able to put into place everything in this 2.5 years, including all these pattern books, design codes, etc., to me that is looking very, very, very ambitious indeed. So I would see it being much more staged myself. That's my own view about it.
Can't you amend the current planning system to do all that?
Yeah, certainly the big debate which will be going on in government, obviously, and you can imagine, Steve. The big debate is about how much needs to go into primary legislation, how much needs to be sort of tearing everything down and starting all over again, and how much can be done by making amendments to the system that we've already got in place. And you're right. Quite a few of the ideas could be done by amending the system we've already got. My big point now on the local plan side of this is that, as I've said elsewhere, having been involved in the LPEG, Local Plan Expert Group, commission, if you like, or task force or whatever, we one of the pieces of work that we commissioned from one of the lawyers in the team was actually to set out all of the legislation which applies to plan making, and it's scary stuff. There are so many statutory provisions in so many statutes covering so many things that I think it's more difficult with the plan making side of things to just do a tweak here and a tweak there. And I think if the scale of the ambition which is set out in the white paper is to be achieved, my own view is it would be best achieved, and perhaps only could be achieved, by a comprehensive wiping the slate clean of the plan making parts of existing legislation and building a new system in the new statute. Now, that doesn't apply across the board, though, because, as you know, in the white paper, where things change the planning applications, etc., that needn't have that sort of fundamental root and branch review in order to achieve what the white paper speaks about. But I do think for local plans, I personally don't see how it's going to be as simple as just saying, well, if we're going to do what's in the white paper, we can do this just by a little tweak here and a little tweak there, because there's such a web of this stuff. When I saw all this on the local, I thought as a practitioner I knew all this stuff, but I was amazed at just how.
On this final note, I'd like to sort of conclude. In retirement, there is no lessening of the passion for planning in Steve Quartermain, and I've thoroughly enjoyed being a bystander to the question. And Christopher, your knowledge of your brief is as ever brilliant and inspiring. I'd like to quickly thank Helen, who organised all this for Kratos, with and Julian, who have been standing by just in case my internet went down. And someone had to stop these two from talking all night about the beliefs. It's clear the white paper is making us all talk about the planning system and looking at it root and branch. It does require the public to support it 100% for it to achieve its admirable aspirations. And the great news is it requires good consultation. So Kratos is available at any given time to support people as we go along. But thank you both very, very much for inspiring us all. And we look forward to the politicians, which Rob Hopgood would suggest will now take over the debate. And if MPs could just stay out of planning, it would make life a lot simpler for us all. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to you all.
Thanks, Kikat.
My pleasure. Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you. Great to talk to you about this. Thank you.